The autumn rain drummed against the windows of Murphy's Corner Market, like skeletal fingers tapping an urgent Morse code. Frank "Bulldog" McKenzie stood behind the counter, his weathered hands counting the day's meager receipts with the same methodical precision he'd once used to count his men after firefights in the Mekong Delta. At 78, his shoulders still carried the invisible weight of command, though they had begun to bow slightly under decades of carrying more than just military decorations. The brass bell above the door chimed, its cheerful sound cutting through the rain's percussion. If you're finding the story gripping so far, it's going to take just 3 more minutes of your time to see how this incredible true story unfolds. And if it moves you like it's moving thousands of others, please hit that like button and share it with someone who needs to hear about real American heroes. Frank looked up from his counting, his pale blue eyes still sharp as the day he'd earned his stripes in basic training, taking in the 3 young men who'd entered his store. Something in their swagger, in the way they moved like wolves testing the air for weakness, made his military instincts whisper warnings that had kept him alive through 2 tours in Vietnam. The leader couldn't have been more than 25, his face already etched with the hard lines that came from choosing the wrong paths too many times. A spiderweb tattoo crawled up his neck, and his eyes held that particular emptiness Frank had seen in soldiers who'd lost their way back to humanity. Behind him, 2 others flanked out with practiced precision. Not military precision, but the kind learned in alleys and holding cells. "Evening, gentlemen," Frank said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had once commanded a company of Marines through hell. "What can I do for you?" The leader, he wore his aggression like an ill-fitting uniform, approached the counter with a predatory grin. "You can start by emptying that register, old man, nice and easy, and nobody gets hurt." Frank's hands stilled on the receipts. In the space of a heartbeat, he was 19 again, crouched in a rice paddy with bullets snapping overhead, making the calculations that separated the living from the dead. But now there were no Marines beside him. No artillery support, no extraction helicopter on the horizon. There was only an old man who'd promised his neighborhood he'd be there for them, standing between chaos and the community he'd sworn to protect. "Son," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through blood and sacrifice. "You don't want to do this. Walk away now and we'll pretend this never happened." The laugh that erupted from the young thug was sharp and brittle, like breaking glass. "Listen to this old fuck. Think you're some kind of tough guy?" His eyes fell on the Medal of Honor, and his grin widened with cruel amusement. "What's this shit? Some kind of participation trophy from the old folks' home?" Frank felt something ancient and dangerous stir in his chest. Not anger, but the cold, calculating fury of a warrior who'd seen too much death to be impressed by punks playing at violence. "That's the Congressional Medal of Honor, awarded for actions above and beyond the call of duty in service to this country." "Service," he spat, reaching across the counter to flick the frame with his finger. "What kind of service? Killing a bunch of rice farmers who couldn't fight back?" The silence that followed was profound, like the moment between lightning and thunder. Frank's eyes, which had seen the faces of dying boys in steaming jungles, which had watched good men make the ultimate sacrifice for strangers they'd never meet, hardened to chips of winter ice. "I earned that medal," Frank said softly, pulling 6 wounded Marines out of a kill zone while under heavy fire. "Took 3 bullets doing it, but every one of those boys made it home to their families." His voice carried the quiet dignity of absolute truth. "What exactly have you ever done for anyone but yourself?" The thug's face flushed red. "Fuck your medal, and fuck you, old man." What happened next would replay in Frank's mind for weeks afterwards, each detail crystal clear in the way that traumatic moments etch themselves into memory. The young man's hand shot out, not for the register, but for the Medal of Honor itself. His fingers closed around the ribbon, yanking it from its frame with deliberate cruelty. "Maybe I'll pawn this piece of shit," he sneered, dangling the national highest military honor like a toy. "What do you think something like this is worth? $20? 50? Frank moved then, his body remembering reflexes trained into muscle and bone over half a century ago. But 81-year-old reflexes, no matter how well trained, are still 81 years old. His hand reached for the metal, and the thug's fist met his temple with the sickening sound of knuckles against skull. Frank went down hard, his hip striking the corner of the counter with a crack that might have been bone or wood. The world tilted sideways, filling with stars and the metallic taste of blood. Through the ringing in his ears, he heard laughter. Young, cruel laughter that had never learned the difference between strength and brutality. "Look at the war hero now," one of them said, and Frank felt a kick connect with his ribs. "Not so tough without your little army friends, are you?" "Should have just opened the register, Grandpa," the leader said, and Frank felt hands rifling through his pockets, taking his wallet, his keys, anything of value. "Now you get to learn what happens to mouthy old fucks who think they're heroes." The beating continued with methodical precision. These weren't the random, heat-of-passion blows of street fighters. They were calculated, designed to inflict maximum pain and humiliation. Frank's glasses shattered, cutting his cheek. His wedding ring, worn for 53 years before Margaret's death and every day since, was torn from his finger, taking skin with it. The Medal of Honor lay on the floor beside him, its ribbon torn. Despite his injuries, Frank's eyes fixed on it. That medal represented more than personal achievement. It carried the weight of every soldier who'd ever put duty before self-preservation, every family who'd received a folded flag instead of a living son. "Please," Frank whispered, blood bubbling on his lips. "Not the medal. That belongs to all of them." The leader heard him and smiled, an expression so devoid of empathy that it belonged to something that had never been human. He picked up the Medal of Honor, holding it at eye level like a trophy. "This piece of shit?" He let it dangle from its torn ribbon. "This is what you're worried about?" Frank tried to speak, to explain what that medal meant, what it represented, but the words came out as bloody whispers. The leader seemed to consider for a moment, then deliberately dropped the medal and ground his heel into it, the scraping sound of metal against concrete echoing through the store like a scream. "There," he said with satisfaction. "Now it matches its owner, broken down and worthless." They left him there, bleeding on the floor of his own store, the cash register emptied, his dignity shredded, his body broken. But worst of all, they left him with the sight of his Medal of Honor, the symbol of everything he'd once stood for, trampled and desecrated beside him. Frank lay there, as the rain continued its percussion against the windows, each drop seeming to count the seconds of his humiliation. His breathing was labored, probably from broken ribs, and his vision swam in and out of focus. But his mind, trained by decades of command decisions, began to work with crystalline clarity. This wasn't just an assault. This wasn't just a robbery. This was a declaration of war against everything he'd spent his life defending, the idea that honor meant something, that sacrifice had value, that there were still things worth fighting for even when the cost seemed too high to bear. Through swollen lips, Frank whispered a name. Michael. His son. Navy SEAL Team 6. A man who'd inherited not just Frank's military bearing, but his absolute conviction that some lines, once crossed, demanded a reckoning. As consciousness began to fade, Frank's last clear thought was a prayer, not for his own healing, but for forgiveness for what he was about to set in motion. Because some wounds couldn't be treated with bandages and good intentions. Some violations of honor required a response that went beyond police reports and court proceedings. The Medal of Honor lay beside him, its metal warm with his blood, waiting for someone worthy to pick it up and restore its meaning. The storm outside intensified, as if nature itself sensed that something fundamental had shifted in the small corner market. Justice, like the rain, was coming, and when it arrived, it would wash clean the streets of anyone who thought honor was just another word, that sacrifice was meaningless, that an old man's dignity was something that could be stolen without consequence. Frank closed his eyes and held on, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, the call was already going out. The Brotherhood was stirring, and hell itself was about to ride to the rescue of one old soldier who'd never learned how to surrender. The call came at 0347 hours, piercing through the pre-dawn darkness of his apartment in Virginia Beach like incoming artillery. His hand found the phone with the same reflexive precision that had once saved his life in Fallujah, muscle memory overriding the fog of sleep. "This is McKenzie." "Michael?" The voice belonged to Detective Sarah Chen, his father's neighbor's daughter who'd grown up calling him Uncle Frank. Her words came wrapped in the kind of professional composure that barely contained personal anguish. "It's about your dad. You need to come home." The world tilted on its axis. Michael sat up in bed, his body shifting automatically into combat readiness, even as his mind struggled to process the impossibility of those words. Frank McKenzie was eternal, immutable, the kind of man who'd outlived the cockroaches and the tax collectors. The idea of his father needing rescue was like being told gravity had stopped working. How bad? 2 words, delivered with the clipped efficiency of a man trained to extract maximum information with minimum communication. "He's alive," Sarah's voice cracked slightly on the words. "But Michael, they hurt him. They hurt him bad. And they—" She paused, and in that silence, Michael heard the echo of something that made his jaw clench with barely controlled fury. "They destroyed his Medal of Honor, ground it into the floor like it was nothing." The phone creaked in Michael's grip. In the span of a heartbeat, he was 8 years old again, watching his father polish that medal with reverent care, listening to the story of Lieutenant Rodriguez and Corpsman Hayes and Sergeant Williams, the men whose lives that medal represented, whose sacrifices it honored. Frank had never told the story to brag. He told it to teach his son that some things were sacred, that honor wasn't just a word, but a way of life that demanded everything and gave back meaning. "Who?" The word emerged from somewhere deep in Michael's chest, a sound more growl than question. "We don't know yet. Street punks probably looking for easy money, but Michael." Sarah's voice took on an edge of warning that she'd learned from 20 years of dealing with men like him, warriors who'd seen too much and carried too many ghosts to ever fully come home. "Whatever you're thinking, don't. Let us handle this through proper channels." Michael ended the call without responding, his mind already shifting into operational mode. Proper channels. As if bureaucracy and courtrooms could address what had been done to his father, as if justice could be measured in jail sentences and fines. Some violations went beyond the reach of law, into territory where only the oldest kind of accounting would suffice. He was dressed and packed within 10 minutes, his movements economical and precise. The go-bag that lived beside his bed contained everything he needed for situations that couldn't wait for proper planning. Cash, identification, weapons, and the kind of tools that never appeared on any official equipment roster. But as he reached for his car keys, Michael paused, his reflection catching his eye in the darkened window. The man looking back at him had his father's eyes, but carried wounds that Frank had been spared. Fallujah, Kandahar, Mogadishu, a dozen other places where Michael had learned that the world contained levels of cruelty that would break ordinary men's hearts. He'd killed 37 people in service to his country, each death catalogued and justified and filed away in classified reports. But this was different. This was personal. And that difference terrified him. Michael had seen what happened when good men crossed certain lines. He'd watched brothers in arms lose themselves in cycles of vengeance, watched them become the very monsters they'd sworn to fight against. The transition was always gradual, always justified, always irreversible. First you bent the rules for the greater good, then you broke them for necessary justice.
Finally, you discovered that you'd become something your father wouldn't recognize. The drive to California gave him 18 hours to wrestle with demons that had names and faces and service records. His phone buzzed constantly, teammates checking in, friends offering support, the Navy wanting to know if he needed compassionate leave. But Michael drove in silence, the radio off, the world reduced to asphalt and yellow lines and the growing weight of decisions he hadn't yet made. Somewhere outside Denver, he pulled into a truck stop and sat in his car, staring at a contact in his phone. Reaper, Marcus Antonelli. They'd served together in Iraq, brothers forged in the furnace of urban warfare. Marcus had left the teams 5 years ago after a mission went sideways, trading his Navy uniform for the leather vest of the Hells Angels. It had been a controversial transition that had cost him friendships and earned him surveillance from alphabet agencies, but Marcus had found something in that brotherhood that the military hadn't been able to give him. A family that didn't answer to politicians or follow rules of engagement. Michael's thumb hovered over the call button. Making this call would cross a line, would set in motion events that couldn't be undone. The Angels weren't peacekeepers or problem solvers, they were a force of nature that operated by their own code, their own sense of justice. Involving them would be like calling down lightning, devastating, precise, and utterly beyond his control once unleashed. But Frank McKenzie hadn't raised his son to turn the other cheek when evil walked unchallenged through the world. He'd raised him to stand between the darkness and the innocent, to be the sword and shield that civilization needed but didn't want to acknowledge. Some lessons once learned couldn't be unlearned. Michael made the call. This story gets even more intense from here, and I promise the next 2 minutes will be worth every second of your time. If you're feeling the same chills I felt researching this, smash that like button and subscribe for more incredible veteran stories that need to be told. "Ghost, you magnificent bastard!" Marcus's voice boomed through the connection, carrying the easy camaraderie of men who'd shared foxholes and firefights. "What's it been 2 years? Please tell me you're finally ready to get out of the government's pocket and join a real brotherhood." Marcus. Michael's voice was steady, but something in its tone must have communicated the gravity of the situation, because his friend's jovial greeting died instantly.
"Someone hurt my father. Badly. And they disrespected his Medal of Honor." The silence that followed was profound. Marcus had never met Frank McKenzie, but he knew the stories, knew what that man meant to Michael, knew that the old Marine represented everything pure and honorable in a world that seemed increasingly short on both qualities. "Where and when?" Marcus asked, his voice shifting into the same operational tone they'd once used to coordinate raids on insurgent strongholds. "California. 3 days ago. The police are investigating, but you want real justice, not the kind that comes with appeals and early parole." Marcus didn't phrase it as a question. "Ghost, you know what happens if you bring the Angels into this. We don't do half measures. We don't leave loose ends. And we sure as hell don't follow the Geneva Convention." Michael closed his eyes, seeing his father's face, remembering the pride in Frank's voice when Michael had earned his trident, the quiet satisfaction of a warrior father watching his son follow in his footsteps. Frank had taught him that protecting the innocent wasn't always clean, wasn't always legal, wasn't always something you could explain to congressional committees or civilian oversight boards. "I know," Michael said. "I'm asking anyway." Another pause, shorter this time. When Marcus spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute commitment. "Then we ride. Give me the details and I'll make some calls. The club owes you for Kabul, and brothers don't let brothers handle this kind of thing alone. This could get complicated. Federal attention, heat on your organization." Marcus laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Brother, we've been dealing with federal attention since before you were born, and the kind of heat that comes from protecting an old war hero, that's the kind of publicity we can live with." As Michael provided the details, the location, the timeline, what little Sarah had told him about the suspects, he felt something shifting inside himself, like tectonic plates finding a new equilibrium.
He was crossing a line, stepping away from the controlled violence of military operations into something older and more primal. But as he thought of his father lying broken on the floor of his own store, of the Medal of Honor ground under the heel of someone who'd never served anything greater than their own appetites, he found he could live with that transformation. The call ended with promises of action and warnings about consequences, but Michael's struggle was far from over. He sat in the truck stop parking lot for another hour, watching ordinary Americans go about their ordinary lives. Truckers grabbing coffee, families on road trips, teenagers flirting by the gas pumps. All of them protected by men like his father, all of them blissfully unaware of the violence required to maintain their peaceful existence. Michael had spent his adult life as that violence, had been the sword in darkness that kept the wolves at bay. But he'd always operated within structures, under orders, with rules of engagement and after-action reports. Now he was contemplating something different. Personal vengeance dressed up as justice, retribution guided by emotion rather than strategy. The worst part was how right it felt. His phone buzzed with the text from Marcus. Rolling out in 6 hours. California chapter is already asking questions. Your old man must have been something special to rate this kind of response. Michael started his car and pulled back onto the highway, the speedometer climbing as the landscape blurred past. His father was lying in a hospital bed, broken by animals who thought strength meant preying on the helpless. The system would process them, eventually, maybe even convict them if the evidence was solid and the prosecutors were competent. They might serve a few years, get out early for good behavior, and go on to hurt someone else's father, unless they encountered a different kind of justice first. As the miles passed, Michael felt the last of his reservations crumble. He'd been trained to be a weapon, forged in the crucible of America's wars, shaped by his father's unwavering moral code. Every mission had been about protecting the innocent, preserving freedom, standing against those who would harm the defenseless. This was just another mission, albeit one without official sanction. The Brotherhood was riding, and hell was coming with them. Michael McKenzie, son of a Medal of Honor recipient, Navy SEAL with more confirmed kills than some entire platoons, was going home. And when he arrived, those who had spilled his father's blood would learn that some debts could only be paid in kind. The speedometer climbed higher, the engine roaring its agreement with his decision. Behind him, the past fell away like discarded armor. Ahead lay California, and the reckoning that waited there. A mechanical heartbeat that announced the arrival of something primal and unstoppable. Michael McKenzie stood in the parking lot of St. Mary's Hospital, his father's blood still staining the shirt he'd worn for 18 hours of driving, and watched as 23 motorcycles rolled into formation with military precision. The Hells Angels California chapter had answered the call, and with them came a brand of justice that existed outside courtrooms and legal precedents.
Marcus Reaper Antonelli dismounted his bike with the fluid grace of a man who'd learned to move silently through hostile territory, his massive frame wrapped in leather that bore the patches and scars of a lifetime spent riding the razor's edge between civilization and chaos. His embrace with Michael was brief but fierce, the kind of brotherhood greeting reserved for men who'd pulled each other out of fire zones and shared the terrible intimacy of combat. "How is he?" Marcus asked, his voice pitched low but carrying the authority that had once commanded reconnaissance teams in the mountains of Afghanistan. "Alive, stable, but they broke more than just his bones." Michael's words came out flat, emotionless, the tone of a man who'd learned to compartmentalize trauma in order to function. "The doctors say he'll recover physically, but the psychological damage?" "Marcus, they ground his Medal of Honor under their heels like it was trash." The silence that followed was pregnant with violence barely held in check. Around them, the other angels dismounted their bikes, their movements coordinated and purposeful. These weren't the stereotypical bikers of popular imagination. Many were veterans themselves, men who'd traded military structure for the brotherhood of the road but retained the skills and mindset of warriors.
Their patches told stories of service and sacrifice, of bonds forged in distant conflicts and maintained through shared understanding of what it meant to stand between order and chaos. "Talk to me about the targets," Marcus said, his tone shifting into operational mode. "What do we know?" Michael pulled out a manila folder that Detective Chen had reluctantly shared, her professional obligations warring with her personal affection for the McKenzie family. Inside were surveillance photos, arrest records, and the kind of intelligence that painted a picture of predators who'd grown bold through unchallenged success. Danny Spider Morrison, 24, career criminal with priors for assault, robbery, and drug dealing. He's the leader, the one who took point on the assault. Michael's voice never changed inflection as he detailed each target with the dispassionate precision of a sniper calling ranges. 2 accomplices, Jorge Vasquez, 22, multiple arrests for gang-related violence, and Kevin Bones Patterson, 26, suspected of at least 3 unsolved murders, but never enough evidence to prosecute. Marcus studied the photos with the same intensity he'd once brought to analyzing terrorists' safe houses. Where do they nest? Morrison operates out of a crack house on the east side, coordinates his crew from there. The other 2 float between there and a bar called Lucifer's Den. Biker bar, but not our kind of bikers. More like wannabe gangsters who think leather jackets make them dangerous. A thin smile played at the corners of Marcus's mouth, the kind of expression that had once made insurgents reconsider their life choices. They picked the wrong old man to fuck with, and they definitely picked the wrong family to mess with. But Ghost, I need you to understand something before we roll. Once we start this, there's no calling it back. The club doesn't do half measures, and we sure as hell don't leave witnesses who might cause problems later. Michael felt something cold and final settle in his chest, like the moment a door closes and locks behind you. He'd crossed moral lines before. Every soldier who'd seen real combat had made decisions that civilian ethics couldn't accommodate. But those were war zones, officially sanctioned operations with legal frameworks and operational orders. This was different. This was choosing to become the monster that civilized society needed but refused to acknowledge. "I understand," he said, and meant it completely. The Angels formed up with the smooth efficiency of a military convoy, their bikes arranged in a loose diamond formation that could adapt to urban streets or highway chases with equal effectiveness. Michael rode pillion behind Marcus, his weight distributed to maintain the bike's balance, while his hands remained free for tactical necessities. The other riders carried their own passengers, prospects earning their place in the brotherhood, old-timers whose presence spoke of decades surviving in a world where weakness was fatal, and specialists whose skills complemented the violence they were riding toward. The first stop was Lucifer's Den, a dive bar that squatted in the industrial district like a tumor on the city's landscape. The building had once housed a legitimate business, but years of criminal occupancy had transformed it into something that looked diseased, its windows boarded, its parking lot littered with broken glass and discarded needles. The kind of place where honest citizens crossed the street rather than risk eye contact with the predators who gathered there. 23 Harleys pulling into that parking lot created a symphony of controlled aggression that sent the bar's usual patrons scrambling for exits. The Angels dismounted with casual confidence, their movements suggesting men who'd walked into hostile environments so many times that it had become routine. They weren't wearing colors that identified their chapter. This operation required a degree of deniability, but their presence was unmistakable. These were apex predators entering territory claimed by wannabes, and the power differential was absolute. Michael followed Marcus through the bar's front door, his tactical awareness automatically cataloging exits, sightlines, potential weapons, and the faces of every person in the dimly lit interior. The place reeked of stale beer, cigarette smoke, and the particular desperation that clung to establishments where dreams went to die. A handful of bikers, the kind that bought their leathers from catalogs and their reputations from intimidating civilians, clustered around the bar, their bravado evaporating as they realized they were outclassed by several orders of magnitude. Behind the bar stood a mountain of a man whose arms told the story of a lifetime spent lifting weights and breaking faces. Prison tattoos covered his skin like a roadmap of violence, and his eyes held the flat affect of someone who'd learned to enjoy hurting people. This was Big Jim Torelli, the bar's owner and a man whose criminal enterprises had flourished in the shadow of official indifference. "Well, well," Big Jim said, his voice carrying the kind of false bravado that preceded either submission or catastrophic miscalculation. "Look what the road dragged in. You boys are in the wrong neighborhood." Marcus approached the bar with the unhurried confidence of a man who'd never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved with the right application of violence. "We're looking for some information, Jim, about 3 shitbirds who robbed an old man a few nights back. Danny Morrison, Jorge Vasquez, Kevin Patterson. Word is they drink here." "Never heard of 'em," Big Jim replied, but his eyes flickered toward a back room in the way that revealed everything Michael needed to know. "Funny thing about that," Marcus continued conversationally, "is that we have video surveillance showing Morrison's car in your parking lot just 2 hours after the assault, so either you're lying or you're running such a shit operation that you don't know who's using your establishment to fence stolen goods." The tension in the room ratcheted up several degrees as the angels spread out with practiced efficiency, each man taking a position that maximized tactical advantage while minimizing the possibility of crossfire. They weren't drawing weapons yet, but their positioning spoke of violence held in reserve, ready to be unleashed at the first sign of resistance. Big Jim's eyes darted around the room, taking in the odds, calculating the cost of defiance versus cooperation. Whatever he saw in those weathered faces convinced him that this wasn't the fight he could win. "They might have been in here. Lot of people come and go. Can't keep track of everyone." "Where are they now?" Michael stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. There was something about his bearing, the perfect posture, the economy of movement, the way his eyes seemed to catalog everything while revealing nothing, that marked him as different from even the hard men surrounding him. "I don't—" Marcus stepped forward and firmly grabbed Big Jim's attention. "Let me clarify the situation for you, Jim. That old man they beat down, he's a Medal of Honor winner, a Marine who earned his stripes in Vietnam, who spent 47 years serving his community after he got done serving his country. And these 3 pieces of shit didn't just rob him, they stomped his medal into the ground like it was garbage." The color drained from Big Jim's face as the implications became clear. There were unwritten rules in the criminal underworld, lines that even the most depraved predators understood shouldn't be crossed. Hurting veterans, especially decorated ones, brought attention from people with the skills and motivation to make that attention extremely unpleasant. "The back room," he wheezed through Marcus's grip. "Patterson is holding court back there, dealing product. Morrison and Vasquez were supposed to meet him an hour ago." Marcus released his hold, and Big Jim staggered backward, his hand rubbing his throat. "How many others?" "Maybe 6, 7, small-time dealers, couple of hookers. Nothing you can't handle." Michael and Marcus exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that developed between men who'd shared life-and-death situations. 7 targets in a confined space, with civilian collateral complications. It was a tactical challenge, but not an insurmountable one. "Here's how this works," Marcus said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone delivering final instructions. "We're going to walk through that door, and you're going to sit right here and mind your own business. When the police show up, and they will show up, you're going to tell them you stepped out for a smoke and didn't see nothing. Are we clear?" Big Jim nodded with the fervor of a man who'd just been given a reprieve from summary execution. "Crystal clear." The back room of Lucifer's den was a testament to humanity's capacity for degradation, a space where every surface seemed contaminated by the moral corruption of its occupants. The air was thick with marijuana smoke and the chemical tang of whatever synthetic drugs were currently poisoning the local youth.
Kevin Bones Patterson sat at a folding table like some twisted monarch holding court, his skeletal frame draped in leather that couldn't disguise the prison pallor of his skin. Around him, a constellation of smaller predators conducted business with the casual efficiency of people who'd never learned to fear consequences. Michael's tactical assessment was instantaneous and comprehensive. 7 targets, 2 showing obvious signs of impairment from drug use, 1 woman who appeared to be a victim rather than a participant, 2 potential exit routes, multiple improvised weapons within reach. The kind of situation that required swift, decisive action to prevent escalation and minimize collateral damage.
Kevin Patterson, Michael announced, his voice cutting through the haze of smoke and criminal conversation like a blade. You're under citizen's arrest for assault, robbery, and destruction of government property. The room froze in the kind of absolute stillness that preceded either submission or explosion. Patterson looked up from his chemical transactions, his drug-addled brain struggling to process this intrusion into his criminal sanctuary. When recognition finally dawned that these weren't police officers or rival dealers, but something far more dangerous, his hand reached automatically for the pistol tucked into his waistband. He never completed the draw. Michael moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd spent years perfecting the art of controlled violence, his body flowing through the sequence of disarm, disable, and control that had been drilled into him through thousands of hours of training. Patterson's weapon was in Michael's hand before the dealer's finger could find the trigger, and Patterson himself was face down on the filthy floor, with his arm twisted behind his back at an angle that suggested any struggle would result in permanent damage. The other occupants of the room began to react, but the angels were already among them, their presence transforming what might have been a chaotic melee into a series of individual surrender scenarios. These weren't street thugs or prison yard toughs. They were warriors with decades of experience in situations where hesitation meant death, and their efficiency was both beautiful and terrifying to witness. "Where are Morrison and Vasquez?" Michael asked, his voice conversational, despite the fact that he was slowly increasing pressure on Patterson's twisted arm. I don't know what you're talking about, man." Patterson's words came out muffled by the floor, but his tone carried the whining desperation of someone who'd suddenly realized he was vastly outclassed. Michael adjusted his grip slightly, and Patterson's denial transformed into a scream that might have been audible outside the building if anyone in this neighborhood was inclined to call for help. Wrong answer. Let's try again. Morrison and Vasquez, where are they? "They're at the house, the crack house on Elm Street. They were supposed to meet me here, but something spooked them." The words tumbled out in a rush, propelled by pain and the sudden understanding that his situation was about to get much worse before it got any better. What spooked them? "Word on the street is that the old man they rolled had connections, military connections. They're laying low until things cool down." Michael felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. These predators had attacked his father expecting no consequences, but now they were hiding like the cowards they'd always been. Fear was a weapon he understood how to use, and he intended to wield it with surgical precision. "Marcus," he called out, never taking his attention from Patterson. "We have an address." "Copy that." Marcus finished zip-tying the last of the room's occupants, his movements economical and professional. "What do we do with this collection of human garbage?" Michael considered the question with the same analytical detachment he'd once brought to planning raids on terrorist compounds. These people were accessories after the fact, small-time criminals whose main contribution to the assault on his father had been providing a place for the perpetrators to feel safe. Justice demanded accountability, but practical considerations suggested that martyring every minor player would create more problems than it solved. "They get to live," Michael decided, his tone suggesting this was a business decision rather than mercy. "But they also get to spread the word that attacking veterans brings consequences, big fucking consequences." He leaned down closer to Patterson's ear, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. Here's what's going to happen, Kevin. We're going to walk out of here, and you're going to wait exactly 1 hour before you cut yourself loose. Then you're going to call every piece of shit criminal you know and tell them what happened here. You're going to explain that Frank McKenzie is under the protection of people who make you look like a fucking Sunday school teacher, and that anyone who so much as looks at him wrong is going to end up in pieces so small they'll need dental records to identify what's left. Patterson nodded with the frantic eagerness of a man who'd just been offered salvation, his drug-addled brain finally grasping that he was being given a chance to walk away from this encounter with all his essential parts intact. The angels filed out of the back room with the same tactical precision they'd displayed going in, their movements coordinated and purposeful. The main bar area had been cleared of patrons, leaving only Big Jim cowering behind his taps and trying very hard to appear invisible. As they passed, Marcus dropped a business card on the bar. Not his official contact information, but the kind of number that connected to people who specialized in permanent solutions to temporary problems.
"If Morrison and Vasquez show up here," Marcus said conversationally, "you call that number immediately. Don't try to be a hero, don't try to warn them, just make the call and get the hell out of the way. Because if we have to come back here looking for them, we're going to be significantly less patient than we were today." The ride to Elm Street took 12 minutes through surface streets that showcased the economic devastation that created environments where predators like Morrison could flourish. Abandoned businesses with broken windows stared blindly at streets lined with cars that hadn't run in years, while the few pedestrians visible moved with the hunched, furtive gait of people who'd learned that drawing attention was dangerous. The crack house occupied a corner lot in what had once been a middle-class neighborhood, its decay a monument to the social pathologies that turned communities into hunting grounds. The building's structure was sound enough to provide shelter, but every other aspect spoke of systematic neglect and criminal occupation. Windows were boarded over or covered with sheets, the front yard was littered with drug paraphernalia and human waste, and the smell of chemical reactions and human desperation hung in the air like a fog. Michael studied the building with the analytical eye of someone trained to breach hostile structures, automatically noting sightlines, potential ambush points, structural weaknesses, and the most efficient routes of approach and withdrawal. This wasn't a military target. There were no hardened positions or sophisticated defensive measures, but it represented something more dangerous in its own way. This was a cancer on the community, a place where predators gathered to feed on human misery and plan their next violations. "How do you want to play this?" Marcus asked, his voice pitched for tactical discussion. "Direct approach. They're expecting to feel safe here, which means they won't be prepared for coordinated resistance. We go in hard and fast, secure the primary targets, extract them for questioning." He paused, considering the moral implications of what he was contemplating. If they resist, we respond with appropriate force. The angels spread out around the building's perimeter with practiced efficiency, their positions calculated to prevent escape while maintaining mutual support in case the situation escalated beyond simple apprehension. These weren't police officers constrained by constitutional protections and departmental policies. They were warriors operating under their own code, and that code placed the protection of innocents above the welfare of predators. Michael approached the front door with Marcus beside him, their movement coordinated and purposeful. The door itself was a joke, a piece of hollow-core wood that wouldn't have stopped a determined child, let alone men trained in forced entry techniques. Michael's boot connected with the frame just below the lock, and the door exploded inward with a crash that announced their arrival to anyone still conscious inside. The interior of the crack house was a vision of human degradation that even Michael's combat experience hadn't fully prepared him for. Bodies lay scattered on filthy mattresses, some conscious from drug use, others simply too far gone to register the intrusion. The smell was overwhelming. A combination of unwashed bodies, human waste, chemical reactions, and the particular stench of despair that seemed to permeate every surface. But Michael's attention was focused on the two figures huddled around a card table in what had once been the building's dining room.
their eyes wide with the kind of panic that came from being cornered by superior predators. Danny Morrison and Jorge Vasquez, the men who'd beaten his father and destroyed his Medal of Honor, sitting in their criminal sanctuary and discovering that some violations brought consequences that couldn't be avoided through intimidation or violence. "Gentlemen," Michael said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who held all the tactical advantages, "we need to have a conversation." Danny Morrison's face went through a fascinating transformation as recognition dawned, from confusion to fear to the desperate calculation of a cornered animal searching for escape routes that didn't exist. Beside him, Jorge Vasquez remained frozen in place, his hand halfway to a pistol that Michael could see would never clear its holster in time to matter. The crack house had become a tomb, its usual chorus of chemical-induced moaning replaced by the kind of silence that preceded either confession or catastrophe. "Do you know who I am?" Michael asked, stepping fully into the room with Marcus flanking him, the other angels maintaining position to cut off any possible retreat. His voice carried the conversational tone of someone discussing the weather, but underneath it lay currents of violence that made the air itself seem to vibrate with potential energy. Morrison's throat worked as he tried to form words, his spiderweb tattoo seeming to pulse with his elevated heart rate. You're the old man's son. The soldier." "Close." Michael moved closer, his boots crunching on debris that spoke of human degradation beyond easy description. "Navy SEAL, 12 years active duty, 37 confirmed kills in service to my country, but that's not what should concern you right now." He paused, letting that information settle into brains that were struggling to process the reality of their situation. Around them, the crack house's usual inhabitants had either fled or rendered themselves invisible, understanding with the survival instincts of bottom feeders that they were witnessing something that transcended their usual experience of urban predation.
"What should concern you," Michael continued, "is that the man you beat half to death, the man whose Medal of Honor you ground under your heel like garbage, is my father. And that medal you destroyed, it didn't just belong to him." Michael reached into his jacket and withdrew a photograph that had lived in his wallet for 15 years, a faded color image of 7 young Marines in dress blues, their faces bright with the particular joy that came from surviving hell together. Frank McKenzie stood in the center, the Medal of Honor ribbon stark against his uniform, surrounded by the men whose lives that decoration represented. "Lieutenant Rodriguez," Michael said, pointing to each face in turn, 23 years old, died pulling wounded out of a kill zone while my father provided covering fire. Corpsman Hayes, 21, died treating casualties under enemy fire while my father carried them to safety. Sergeant Williams, 24, died holding a position so my father could extract the wounded. His voice never changed inflection, never rose above conversational level, but each name carried the weight of absolute truth, each story a testament to sacrifice that men like Morrison could never comprehend. Jorge Vasquez began to tremble, his drug-addled brain finally grasping that they hadn't just robbed an old man, they'd desecrated something sacred, violated a bond forged in blood and brotherhood. "That medal you stomped into the floor," Michael continued, "represented 6 men who died so others could live. 6 families who received folded flags instead of living sons. 6 graves that my father visits every year, not because he has to, but because he understands that honor isn't just a word, it's a debt that can never be fully repaid." Morrison found his voice, though it came out as a croak. "We didn't know, man. We just needed the money. It wasn't personal." The silence that followed was profound,
filled with the kind of moral vacuum that occurred when evil tried to justify itself to goodness. Michael studied Morrison's face with the detached interest of someone examining an insect, searching for any trace of genuine remorse, any indication that this creature possessed the capacity for understanding what it had done. "Wasn't personal," Michael repeated slowly, as if testing the words for meaning. "You beat an 81-year-old man unconscious. You broke his ribs, his glasses, took his wedding ring. You ground the nation's highest military honor under your heel. And it wasn't personal." He moved closer, close enough that Morrison could smell the leather and gunpowder that clung to his clothes, close enough to see the particular emptiness that lived behind Michael's eyes, the void that opened in men who'd seen too much death to be impressed by threats from cowards. "Let me tell you what personal is," Michael said, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than any shout. "Personally, I spent 18 hours driving across the country while my father lay in a hospital bed, wondering if the old man who taught me everything I know about honor was going to survive long enough for me to say goodbye. Personal is looking at surveillance photos of his blood on the floor of the store where he served his community for 47 years. Marcus stepped forward, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to swallow what little light penetrated the boarded windows. Personal is calling in favors from men who spent their lives riding the edge between civilization and chaos. Men who understand that some violations demand payment in blood. Around them, the angels had formed a loose circle, their presence transforming the crack house into something that felt more like a courtroom than a crime scene. These weren't police officers bound by constitutional protections and departmental policies. They were warriors, operating under their own code, and that code had no provision for mercy towards predators who attacked the innocent. Jorge Vasquez finally found his voice, though it emerged as little more than a whimper. "Please, man, we'll make it right. We'll pay him back. We'll... "Pay him back?" Michael's interruption carried the flat finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. "With what? The money you stole from him? The dignity you stripped away? The faith in humanity you destroyed when you proved that evil can triumph if good men do nothing?" He reached into another pocket and withdrew something that made Morrison's face go white as fresh snow. A small plastic evidence bag containing the fragments of Frank McKenzie's Medal of Honor, the star-shaped medallion cracked, the ribbon torn, the entire decoration bearing the scuff marks of boots that had tried to destroy what it represented. "This is what's left of my father's Medal of Honor," Michael said, holding the bag up to catch what little light filtered through the boarded windows. 43 years he carried this, not because he was proud of what it represented about him, but because he understood what it meant to the men who died earning it. And you ground it into the floor like it was trash. The bag trembled in Morrison's vision, and for the first time since this confrontation began, something that might have been genuine emotion flickered across his face. It wasn't remorse. Men like Morrison were incapable of that level of moral development. But it was recognition, the dawning understanding that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, violated something that demanded retribution beyond the reach of civil courts.
"The question now," Marcus said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions, "is how that debt gets paid. See, the way I figure it, you've got two choices. Option one, we turn you over to the police, you get processed through the system, maybe serve a few years if you're unlucky, get out early for good behavior, and go on to hurt someone else's father.
He paused, letting that scenario settle into minds that were beginning to grasp their limited options. Option 2, we handle this ourselves, right here, right now. Permanent solution to a permanent problem. Morrison's eyes darted around the room, searching for escape routes that didn't exist, allies who weren't coming, weapons that wouldn't help him against men who'd spent their lives perfecting the art of violence. The crack house had become a trap, and he was beginning to understand that all his previous success at intimidating civilians had been practiced for a test he was destined to fail. "There's a third option," Michael said quietly, and something in his tone made everyone in the room focus their complete attention on his words. "You help us understand something that's been bothering me since this whole thing started." He moved closer to Morrison, close enough that the dealer could see the controlled fury that lived behind his calm exterior, close enough to understand that this was a man who'd killed professionally and efficiently for his country, and could do so again for his family. See, Jorge here is muscle. Dumb muscle. The kind of guy who does what he's told without thinking about consequences. But you, Danny, you're supposed to be the brains of this operation. You plan jobs, you scope targets, you make the decisions. Michael's voice carried genuine curiosity, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle that had been bothering him. So, explain to me how someone smart enough to run a criminal enterprise was stupid enough to target a Medal of Honor winner. Morrison's mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air, his brain struggling to formulate an answer that might somehow reduce his culpability. "We didn't know. The medal, it was just sitting there. We thought it was some kind of fake military shit from a surplus store." "But you could read," Michael pointed out with ruthless logic. "The inscription is right there on the back. For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty. Those aren't words you put on costume jewelry." The silence stretched, filled with the sound of Morrison's increasingly labored breathing and the subtle shifting of the angels as they maintained their positions. Finally, Jorge Vasquez spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Danny said it didn't matter. Said the old man was just some washed-up jarhead who probably bought the medal at a pawn shop. Said even if it was real, who was going to care about some old fuck who couldn't even defend himself?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees as the implications of those words settled into the minds of men who'd spent their lives defending the idea that service and sacrifice meant something. Michael felt something cold and final crystallize in his chest, the last vestige of mercy solidifying into absolute resolve. "Who was gonna care?" he repeated softly. "About a Medal of Honor winner. About a man who spent 2 tours in Vietnam earning the right to grow old in peace. About someone who'd given more to his country than you parasites will ever understand." Marcus stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the handle of a knife that had seen use in places that didn't appear on official maps. "Sounds like we have our answer, Ghost. These pieces of shit knew exactly what they were doing, and they did it anyway." But Michael held up a hand, his attention still focused on Morrison with laser intensity. "There's something else. Something that doesn't add up." He moved closer, close enough that Morrison could smell the leather and cordite that seemed to cling to his clothes like cologne. "My father's been running that store for decades. He knows everyone in the neighborhood, and everyone knows him. The idea that 3 random punks would just happen to pick his place to rob, that's a hell of a coincidence." Morrison's eyes flickered, just for an instant, but enough for someone trained to read micro-expressions under interrogation conditions. Michael saw it, cataloged it, and understood that there were layers to this violation that went beyond simple criminal opportunism. "Who told you about the store, Danny?" The question came out flat and declarative, not a request for information, but a demand for confirmation of what Michael already suspected. "Who told you about the old man who kept cash in his register and wouldn't fight back?" "I don't know what you're talking about." Michael moved closer. His presence made Morrison understand the seriousness of the situation. "Wrong answer. See, the thing about growing up in that neighborhood is that you learn who talks to who has connections where. And the thing about being a SEAL is that you learn how to extract information from people who don't want to give it up. Morrison's eyes bulged as Michael's grip tightened incrementally, just enough to demonstrate the futility of resistance without crossing the line into lethal force. Around them, the angels maintained their positions with the patient stillness of predators who understood that effective interrogation was as much about psychological pressure as physical coercion.
"Last chance," Michael said conversationally. "Who gave you my father's name? Who told you he was vulnerable? Who set up a Medal of Honor winner to be beaten and robbed by pieces of shit who wouldn't last 5 minutes in a real fight?" The pressure increased slightly, and Morrison's survival instincts finally overcame his criminal loyalty. Tommy Castellano? He runs numbers for the Torino family. Said the old man was sitting on a pile of cash and wouldn't call the cops because he didn't trust the system." Michael released his grip, and Morrison collapsed backward, gasping and clutching his throat. But the information had opened new channels of understanding, new connections that painted a picture of calculated malice rather than random violence. Tommy Castellano was a name Michael recognized from his father's stories, a neighborhood kid who'd gone wrong, started working for organized crime, developed the kind of resentment toward honest men that came from choosing corruption over character. "Why?" Michael asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Why target my father specifically?" Morrison rubbed his throat, his eyes darting between Michael and Marcus, as if trying to calculate whether honesty would improve or worsen his situation. "Castellano said the old man had embarrassed him somehow, made him look bad in front of his crew. Said it was time someone taught him that being a war hero didn't make him untouchable." The pieces fell into place with the crystalline clarity of a completed puzzle. This hadn't been a random crime of opportunity. It had been a calculated assault on everything Frank McKenzie represented, an attempt to prove that honor and sacrifice were meaningless in a world where power came from the willingness to hurt innocent people. Marcus let out a low whistle that carried more menace than any curse. "So we're not just dealing with street thugs who got lucky. We're dealing with organized crime using local predators to settle personal grudges." Michael felt the tactical situation expanding beyond its original parameters, the simple equation of father attacked, son response, evolving into something more complex and dangerous. The Torino family wasn't a collection of small-time dealers and street thugs. They were connected, organized, and possessed resources that could turn this personal vendetta into a full-scale war. But as he looked at the fragment of his father's Medal of Honor, still clutched in his hand like a piece of his own heart, Michael found that the prospect of escalation didn't frighten him. Some battles choose you, regardless of the odds or consequences. Some principles were worth fighting for, even when victory came at a price that rational men would consider too high to pay. "Change of plans," he said, his voice carrying the authority of command that had once directed operations in the world's most dangerous places. "We're not just collecting debt anymore. We're sending a message that attacking veterans, any veteran, anywhere, brings consequences that organized crime can't intimidate or buy their way out of." Morrison's face went white as he realized that his confession had transformed him from a simple target into a strategic asset, a source of intelligence that could be leveraged into something far more dangerous than personal revenge. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to bargain or plead, but Michael's raised hand silenced him with the finality of a judge's gavel. "You're going to help us," Michael said simply. "You're going to tell us everything you know about Tommy Castellano, about the Torino family's operations, about every detail of how this attack was planned and coordinated. And in exchange, you get to live long enough to see what real justice looks like." The crack house had become something more than a crime scene or interrogation chamber.
It had transformed into a war room where the final battle for Frank McKenzie's honor was about to begin. The warehouse district at 3 in the morning was a cathedral of shadows and industrial silence, broken only by the distant hum of highway traffic and the occasional creak of settling metal. Tommy Castellano sat bound to a chair in the center of what had once been a legitimate shipping operation, his expensive suit wrinkled and stained, his carefully cultivated image of criminal sophistication reduced to the sweating terror of a man who'd finally encountered consequences for his choices. "You're comfortable, Tommy?" Michael asked conversationally, his tone suggesting genuine concern for his captive's welfare. "Because we're going to be here for a while, and I want to make sure that you're able to give this conversation your full attention." Castellano's eyes darted around the warehouse, taking in the angels' positions, cataloging the tools that had been arranged on a nearby table with surgical precision, calculating odds that decreased with every passing second. He was a madman in an organization that commanded respect through fear, but fear was a currency that had no value when measured against the kind of absolute resolve that filled this building like a living thing.
"You know who I am?" Castellano asked, his voice carrying the false bravado of someone who'd never learned the difference between intimidation and actual power. "You know who I work for?" The Torino family doesn't forget when someone crosses them. Marcus Antonelli stepped forward, his massive frame casting shadows that seemed to swallow what little light penetrated the warehouse windows. "Funny thing about that, Tommy. See, we made some calls before we picked you up, had some conversations with people who matter in your organization." He pulled out a cell phone and scrolled through recent messages, his expression suggesting someone reading amusing fiction rather than life-and-death communications. "Turns out that when you explain to Don Torino's consigliere that one of his middle managers decided to wage war against Medal of Honor winners, the response is pretty fucking clear." The color drained from Castellano's face as the implications became apparent. Organized crime operated according to its own code of honor, twisted and self-serving though it might be, and that code included certain inviolable principles. Attacking law enforcement brought heat, targeting federal assets brought federal attention, and hurting decorated veterans brought the kind of publicity that made legitimate businesses nervous about their criminal associations. "They cut you loose, Tommy," Marcus continued with genuine amusement. "Officially, you're acting without family sanction. Unofficially, they suggested we make this problem disappear permanently and quietly." Michael moved closer to the bound man, his footsteps echoing through the warehouse with metronomic precision. "But that would be too easy, wouldn't it? Too clean. See, the thing about honor is that it demands more than just elimination of threats. It requires understanding, acknowledgement, restoration of what was taken." He reached into his jacket and withdrew the plastic evidence bag containing the fragments of his father's Medal of Honor, the damaged decoration catching what light existed and reflecting it back in fractured patterns that seemed to fill the warehouse with ghosts of better men. "Do you know what this represents, Tommy?" He held the bag at eye level, forcing Castellano to confront the physical evidence of his crime. Not just the medal itself, but what it means to the men who earned the right to wear it. Castellano's mouth worked soundlessly, his brain struggling to formulate words that might somehow reduce his culpability or earn him mercy from men who'd already demonstrated they operated beyond such considerations. The warehouse had become a courtroom where the only law was the ancient code that demanded blood for blood, honor for dishonor. "My father earned this medal in a rice paddy in Vietnam. He was 24 years old, leading a patrol that walked into a coordinated ambush. 6 of his men went down in the first 30 seconds, wounded but alive, trapped in a kill zone with enemy fire coming from 3 directions." The Angels had heard versions of this story before. Every military unit had its legends, its tales of impossible courage in the face of certain death, but the way Michael told it, with the flat precision of someone reciting facts rather than seeking dramatic effect, gave it the weight of sacred text. Standard military doctrine says you call for artillery, suppress the enemy positions, wait for medical evacuation. But my father looked at those wounded Marines, boys, really,
18 and 19 years old, and he made a different choice. Michael's eyes never left Castellano's face, searching for any sign of comprehension, any indication that this creature possessed the capacity to understand what sacrifice meant. He went into that kill zone 6 times. 6 times, Tommy. Each trip under concentrated fire, each Marine carried to safety while bullets snapped past his head and mortar rounds shook the earth under his feet. On the 4th trip, he took a round through the shoulder. On the 6th, shrapnel from an RPG opened up his leg from knee to hip. The warehouse was absolutely silent except for the sound of Castellano's increasingly labored breathing and the distant rumble of late-night traffic. Even the angels, men who'd seen their own share of violence and sacrifice, listened with the reverence due to stories of genuine heroism. But he didn't stop. Couldn't stop. Because stopping meant those boys died alone in a foreign country, their families getting folded flags instead of living sons. So he kept going back, kept pulling them out, until every single Marine made it to the evacuation zone alive. He held up the damaged metal again, its torn ribbon fluttering slightly in the warehouse's still air. 6 men lived because my father chose their lives over his own safety. 6 families got to welcome their sons home, 6 careers, 6 marriages, 6 collections of children and grandchildren, all because one man understood that honor isn't just a word. It's a commitment that transcends self-preservation. He moved closer to Castellano, close enough that the bound man could see the controlled fury that lived behind his column exterior, close enough to understand that this wasn't just about personal revenge, but about something far more fundamental. "And you," he said softly, "you had this symbol of sacrifice and service ground into the floor like garbage. Not because you needed money, not because you were desperate or hungry, but because you wanted to prove that good men are vulnerable, that honor is meaningless, that 30 years of service to community means nothing when measured against your bruised ego."
Castellano found his voice, though it emerged as little more than a croak. "I didn't know about the medal, about what it meant. I just wanted to teach the old man a lesson about respect." Respect. Michael repeated the word as if tasting something bitter. "You wanted respect from a man who earned it through blood and sacrifice, who spent 47 years serving his community after he finished serving his country? And when he didn't give you the deference you thought you deserved, you sent 3 animals to beat him unconscious and destroy the most precious thing he owned?" The silence that followed was pregnant with violence, barely held in check. But Michael wasn't finished. He had one more revelation, one final piece of the puzzle that would determine how this night ended. "There's something else you need to understand, Tommy. Something about the nature of brotherhood, about the bonds that connect men who've shared more than just geography and circumstance." Michael gestured to the angels surrounding them, to men whose patches told stories of service and sacrifice that extended far beyond their motorcycle club affiliations. Marcus served 3 tours in Afghanistan before he traded his Navy uniform for that leather vest. Staff Sergeant Williams over there, yeah, that's right, same last name as one of the Marines my father saved, lost his leg to an IED in Iraq. Half the men in this room are veterans, Tommy. Half of them understand personally what that medal represents. Castellano's eyes widened as the full scope of his miscalculation became apparent. He hadn't just attacked one old veteran. He'd declared war on a brotherhood that spanned decades and stretched across the country, a network of men who'd sworn oaths to defend the innocent and who took those oaths seriously long after their active duty had ended. "So here's what's going to happen," Michael continued, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. "You're going to make this right. Not because we're asking nicely, not because you suddenly developed a conscience, but because the alternative is worse than anything your imagination can conjure." He reached into another pocket and withdrew a check already made out to the Veterans Administration, the amount blank, but the signature space waiting for Castellano's trembling hand. $100,000, donated in my father's name to the fund that helps disabled veterans transition back to civilian life. Castellano stared at the check as if it were a death warrant, his criminal mind calculating the financial impact of such a donation against the certain consequences of refusal. "I don't have that kind of liquid cash." "Then you'll get it," Marcus interrupted, his tone suggesting this wasn't a negotiation. "Sell whatever you need to sell, liquidate whatever assets require liquidation, call in whatever debts are owed to you. Because in 72 hours, that check is better clear, or we're going to revisit this conversation under less comfortable circumstances." But Michael wasn't finished. The money was important, would help veterans who needed support, but it didn't address the deeper violation, the attack on the principles that held civilization together. "There's something else," he said, producing a second document from his jacket, a formal letter of apology, to be published in the local newspaper, explaining your role in the attack on my father and acknowledging the true meaning of military service and sacrifice. Castellano's face went white as he read the typed text, understanding that signing such a document would destroy his reputation in the criminal community, while making him a target for anyone who considered cooperation with law enforcement to be unforgivable betrayal. "And finally," Michael said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "you're going to help us establish something new in this city, a network of protection for veterans, a system that ensures no decorated service member ever again becomes a target for pieces of shit who think honor is weakness." The warehouse had become a cathedral of judgment, its shadows seeming to press closer as the weight of absolute justice filled the space between the corrugated walls. Castellano was being offered a choice, but it was the kind of choice that existed only in the space between different forms of damnation. "I'll need guarantees," he said finally, his voice carrying the defeated tone of someone who'd exhausted all options except survival. Michael considered this request with the analytical detachment of someone calculating military odds. Clemency was possible, but only within carefully defined parameters that ensured future compliance and prevented recurrence of the original problem. "You honor every commitment you make tonight, and this matter is closed. You fulfill the financial obligation, publish the apology, cooperate with establishing veteran protection protocols, and you get to live long enough to consider the choices that brought you to this moment." He paused, letting the conditional nature of mercy settle into Castellano's consciousness. "But if you default on any element of this agreement, if you attempt retaliation against my father or any other veteran, if you even consider backing out once you're safely back in your familiar criminal environment—"
The threat hung in the air, unfinished but perfectly clear in its implications. The angels shifted slightly, their movement suggesting predators preparing to act on barely restrained instincts. Castellano signed the documents with hands that shook like autumn leaves, his expensive pen scratching across paper that would define the rest of his life. The financial commitment, the public humiliation, the ongoing obligations, all of it calculated to ensure that this violation of honor carried consequences that would resonate far beyond this single night. But for Michael, the most important moment came when he carefully extracted the fragments of his father's Medal of Honor from their evidence bag and placed them in a new container marked for delivery to the Congressional Medal of Honor Society's restoration services. The decoration could be repaired, its physical form restored to match its symbolic importance. Some things, once broken, could be made whole again. As dawn approached, painting the warehouse windows with the pale light of new possibilities, Michael stood alone among the departed angels and contemplated the night's work. Justice had been served, but not through courtrooms or legal proceedings, through the older law that existed before civilization created bureaucracies to mediate between right and wrong.
His father would disapprove of the methods, would worry about the moral cost of choosing vigilante justice over legal channels. But Frank McKenzie had also taught his son that some principles were worth fighting for, regardless of the personal price, and that honor demanded action when good men encountered evil in the world. The warehouse empty now, except for shadows and the lingering scent of violence barely averted, Michael walked toward his motorcycle and the road that would take him home. 3 days later, Frank McKenzie stood in his store, his Medal of Honor restored to its place of honor, knowing that some debts had been paid in full. Justice had been served, honor had been restored, and the Brotherhood would always protect their own. Behind him, justice had been served in the ancient way, measured not in jail sentences or fines, but in the restoration of what had been taken and the establishment of consequences that would prevent future violations. Some debts could only be paid in full understanding, complete acknowledgement, and the kind of restitution that made the victim whole again. Tonight, Frank McKenzie's honor had been restored, his sacrifice acknowledged, his service properly recognized by men who understood the true cost of freedom. The Brotherhood had ridden, and hell had come with them. But from that darkness, something pure had emerged. The knowledge that heroes never truly stand alone, that honor is worth defending, and that some violations demand a response that transcends law and reaches into the realm of absolute justice.
The frame itself was new, crafted by a local woodworker who'd refused payment for what he considered an honor to create. Surrounding the medal were photographs that told the story of Frank's continued service, ribbon-cutting ceremonies for veteran housing projects funded by an anonymous donation, newspaper clippings about the McKenzie Foundation for Veteran Assistance, images of Frank speaking at schools about the true meaning of service and sacrifice. The foundation had been Tommy Castellano's idea, or rather, his desperate attempt to fulfill obligations that had saved his life while destroying his criminal career. The $100,000 donation had grown through matching funds from corporations whose executives understood the value of positive publicity, creating an endowment that would provide support for disabled veterans for decades to come. Castellano's public apology, published in newspapers across the city, had sparked a broader conversation about the treatment of veterans and the debt society owed to those who'd served. But perhaps the most meaningful change had been the establishment of the Veteran Protection Network, an informal but highly effective organization that ensured no decorated service member would again become a target for predators who mistook honor for weakness. The network operated quietly, its existence known primarily through word-of-mouth warnings that spread through criminal communities like gospel truth. Touch a veteran and face consequences that no lawyer could negotiate, no judge could mitigate, no prison sentence could defer. The bell chimed again, and Frank looked up to see a familiar figure entering the store. Not a customer, but someone whose presence had become a regular and welcome part of his new routine. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez, recently retired from the Army after 23 years of service, had relocated to California to take advantage of educational benefits while staying close to the veteran community that had become her chosen family. "Morning, Frank," she said, her bearings still carrying the unmistakable stamp of military discipline even in civilian clothes. "How's business?" "Can't complain," but his smile carried deeper meaning. Business had actually improved dramatically since the attack, as community members made deliberate choices to support the store that had become a symbol of resilience. But more importantly, the store had evolved into something approaching a community center, a place where veterans could gather informally, where stories could be shared, where the invisible wounds of service could be acknowledged and addressed. Sarah had been instrumental in that transformation, organizing weekly coffee sessions that brought together veterans from different eras and branches of service.
Vietnam veterans like Frank found common ground with Iraq and Afghanistan veterans like the young Marine who'd lost his leg to an IED outside Fallujah. The coffee was terrible, the chairs were mismatched, and the conversations sometimes grew heated over philosophical differences, but the underlying bond of shared service created connections that transcended generational and ideological divisions. Michael called this morning, and Sarah's expression brightened with genuine affection. He's coming home for the ceremony next week. The ceremony in question was the dedication of the McKenzie Veterans Memorial Garden, a project that had emerged from the community's desire to honor not just Frank's service, but the broader legacy of all who'd worn the uniform. The garden would occupy a small plot of land behind the store, its design incorporating elements that spoke to different aspects of military service, a reflection pool for quiet contemplation, benches arranged to encourage conversation, memorial stones bearing the names of local veterans who'd made the ultimate sacrifice. Michael's involvement in the project had been characteristically thorough and understated. He'd coordinated with landscape architects, liaised with city planning officials, and somehow managed to navigate the bureaucratic maze that typically made such projects take years rather than months. But he'd done it all from a distance, visiting only briefly, and always seeming slightly uncomfortable with the attention his efforts generated. "How's he doing?" Sarah asked, her tone carrying the concern of someone who understood the particular challenges faced by warriors transitioning back to civilian life. Frank considered the question carefully, weighing what he knew against what he suspected about his son's ongoing struggle with the choices he'd made. "He's finding his way, taking some time to figure out what comes next now that his active duty is finished." The truth was more complicated, as truth usually was when it involved men who'd spent their adult lives in service to ideals that civilian society honored in theory, but often misunderstood in practice. Michael had declined to re-enlist when his term expired, officially citing a desire to pursue civilian opportunities, but privately struggling with questions about the moral cost of the justice he'd helped orchestrate. The Navy had offered him opportunities that would have guaranteed continued advancement, staff positions that would have utilized his operational experience while keeping him safely away from trigger-pulling assignments. But something in Michael had changed during those dark hours in the warehouse, some fundamental shift in his understanding of the relationship between official authority and moral necessity. He needed time to process that transformation, to determine whether he could continue serving within structures that sometimes prioritized political considerations over absolute justice. "The Brotherhood is looking after him," Frank added, and Sarah nodded with understanding. The informal network of veterans who'd rallied around the McKenzie family included active duty personnel who made sure Michael had access to counseling and support services regardless of his official status. Combat veterans understood better than most that the transition from warrior to civilian required more than just changing uniforms. It demanded a fundamental reimagining of identity and purpose.
The afternoon brought its usual parade of customers, neighbors, and visitors who'd heard about Frank's story and wanted to see for themselves the man who'd become a symbol of veteran resilience. Frank handled each interaction with grace and dignity, never seeking to capitalize on his celebrity, but always willing to share lessons learned through decades of service and survival. Among the visitors was a young reporter from the local newspaper, working on a follow-up story about the impact of veteran support programs in the community. Frank agreed to the interview reluctantly, still uncomfortable with attention that felt too much like praise for simply surviving an assault. But he understood that his story had become larger than personal experience. It had become a vehicle for broader conversations about how society treated its veterans. "What would you want people to understand about military service?" the reporter asked, her pen poised over a notepad that seemed inadequate for capturing the complexity of such a question. Frank considered his response carefully, looking past the reporter to the photographs on the wall that showed neighborhood children playing safely in streets, protected by men and women who'd sworn oaths to defend them. "Service isn't about being thanked," he said finally. "It's about understanding that freedom requires constant vigilance, that civilization needs guardians, and that some things are worth sacrificing for, even when, especially when, the cost seems too high to bear." He paused, his eyes finding the Medal of Honor in its place of honor beside the register. The men and women who serve today, they're not looking for parades or special treatment. They're looking for the chance to come home to a society that remembers what they fought for, that honors the principles they were willing to die defending. The reporter scribbled notes furiously, but Frank doubted that words on paper could convey the deeper truth he was trying to express. Military service created bonds that transcended normal human relationships, forged connections between people who might otherwise have nothing in common except their willingness to put duty before self-interest. As evening approached and the last customers departed, Frank began his closing routine, counting the day's receipts, securing the register, checking locks and lights with the methodical precision of someone who'd learned that attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. But tonight there was an additional element to his routine, something that had become as important as any security measure. He walked to the back of the store, where a small alcove had been set aside for a memorial to the men whose lives his Medal of Honor represented. 6 photographs, arranged with military precision, showed the faces of Marines who'd never had the chance to grow old, to see their children graduate, to experience the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. Lieutenant Rodriguez, Corpsman Hayes, Sergeant Williams, and 3 others whose names were engraved on a simple plaque beneath their images. Frank stood before that memorial every evening, not from obligation, but from love, the love that connected survivors to the fallen, that bound the living to the memory of those who'd paid the ultimate price for abstract concepts like freedom and justice. It was a daily reminder that his survival carried responsibilities, that the years granted to him after that rice paddy in Vietnam weren't just personal gifts, but trusts to be honored through continued service. "Still here, boys," he whispered, his voice carrying the same affection he'd once used to encourage frightened young Marines before dangerous missions. "Still keeping the faith." The door chimed one final time, and Frank turned to see a figure silhouetted against the evening light, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the controlled precision that marked him as a warrior even in civilian clothes. Michael had come home early, drawn by some instinct that told him his father needed company on this particular evening. "Hey, Dad!" Michael's voice carried the particular warmth reserved for moments when words seemed inadequate for the emotions they were trying to convey. "Son." Frank's embrace was fierce and brief, the kind of greeting shared by men who understood that some bonds transcended the need for extensive verbal communication. "Good flight?" "Long but uneventful. Military efficiency meets civilian bureaucracy." Michael's smile was genuine, but touched with the weariness that came from traveling between worlds that operated according to fundamentally different principles. They stood together in comfortable silence, 2 generations of McKenzie men sharing the quiet satisfaction of another day successfully completed. Outside, the neighborhood settled into evening routines. Children called in for dinner, porch lights flickering on, the simple domestic rhythms that military service existed to preserve and protect. "Any word from Marcus?" Frank's tone was carefully neutral, but carrying undertones of genuine concern. "He's doing well. The club is thriving, staying busy with legitimate business and community outreach." Michael's response carried the satisfaction of someone who'd seen friends successfully navigate difficult transitions. "Turns out that protecting veterans is good for the Angels' public image. They've got contracts with the VA now.
providing security for veteran events and transportation for disabled service members.
The transformation of the Hells Angels from criminal organization to veteran advocacy group had been gradual but remarkable, driven by the recognition that their military experience and organizational skills could be channeled toward positive community impact. It hadn't been a complete metamorphosis. The Angels remained a brotherhood that operated outside conventional social structures, but their focus had shifted toward protecting rather than exploiting society's vulnerable populations. And Tommy? Frank's question carried no malice, just curiosity about the man whose choices had set this entire chain of events in motion. Still alive, still making payments to the foundation, his criminal career is effectively over. Turns out that publicly apologizing to Medal of Honor winners makes you persona non grata in organized crime circles. Michael's tone suggested someone discussing an interesting sociological phenomenon rather than personal revenge. He's working construction now, manual labor, says it gives him time to think about the choices that brought him to that warehouse. Frank nodded thoughtfully, understanding that justice sometimes took forms that courts and legal systems couldn't provide. Castellano's punishment hadn't been imprisonment or financial penalties, but the complete restructuring of his life around principles of accountability and service. Whether that transformation would prove permanent remained to be seen, but the initial results suggested that even hardened criminals could learn to respect boundaries when the consequences of crossing them were absolute and immediate. As they prepared to leave the store, Frank's hand automatically checked the metal's frame one final time, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. The decoration caught the last light of day, its star-shaped form seeming to glow with inner fire, its ribbon straight and proud against the simple wooden background. "You know what I'm proudest of?" Frank said suddenly, his voice carrying the weight of revelation. Michael looked at him with the patient attention of someone who'd learned that his father's insights were worth hearing, regardless of the timing or context. "Not the medal itself, though it means everything to me. Not even the fact that those boys made it home, though that's worth more than any decoration." Frank paused, choosing his words with the care of someone who understood their lasting impact. "I'm proudest that you understand what it represents, that you know the difference between serving something greater than yourself and just wearing a uniform." The words hung in the evening air, carrying the weight of generational wisdom passed from father to son, from one warrior to another. Michael felt something shift in his chest, some long-held tension finally releasing, as he understood that his father's approval wasn't conditional on specific career choices or official recognition. "The choices you made that night, in the warehouse, they weren't easy ones to make. They came with costs that will follow you for the rest of your life. But they were the right choices, made for the right reasons, and I'm proud to call you my son." Michael felt tears he hadn't shed since childhood threatening to spill over, emotions too long suppressed finally finding expression in the safety of his father's acceptance. "I wasn't sure you'd see it that way. The methods we used, the lines we crossed. Son, every generation of warriors faces the same choice, whether to follow rules that protect the guilty or principles that defend the innocent. You chose principles, and you chose them knowing the personal cost. That's what honor looks like in the real world, not following orders blindly, but making hard choices when good men encounter evil." They walked together toward the parking lot where Michael's motorcycle waited, the machine that had carried him across the country on a mission of vengeance that had transformed into something approaching redemption. The Harley gleamed under the streetlights, its chrome reflecting the image of two men who'd found their way back to each other through the crucible of shared understanding. "What's next for you?" Frank asked as Michael prepared to depart for his hotel. "I'm thinking about staying local for a while. Maybe opening a security consulting business, something that lets me use my skills to help people who need protection. The veteran community here could use someone who understands both the threats they face and the resources available to address them." Frank smiled with the satisfaction of someone who'd seen a beloved son find his path through life's complexities. "The neighborhood could use that kind of expertise, and I could use someone I trust helping me plan the next phase of the foundation's work." The suggestion hung in the air between them,
an invitation to collaboration that would keep family close while serving the broader community of veterans that had become their shared responsibility. Michael felt something settle in his chest, the particular peace that came from finding purpose that aligned with principles. As he rode through streets made safe by the sacrifices of better men and women, Michael reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 6 months ago, he was a warrior without a war, a professional killer struggling to find meaning in a civilian world that honored his service in theory while remaining willfully ignorant of its practical requirements.
The assault on his father had provided clarity, stripping away the philosophical complexities that had paralyzed him and revealing the simple truth that some things were worth fighting for regardless of official sanction or legal approval. Honor wasn't a word to be defined by politicians or bureaucrats. It was a principle to be lived by men and women who understood that civilization required guardians willing to stand between order and chaos. The motorcycle's engine provided a rhythmic backdrop to his thoughts as he navigated familiar streets, each turn bringing him closer to accommodations that felt more like home than any place he'd lived since childhood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to serve, new chances to prove that the lessons learned in distant wars could be applied to the quieter battles of civilian life. But tonight, Frank McKenzie's honor had been restored, his sacrifice acknowledged, his service properly recognized by a community that understood the debt they owed to those who'd worn the uniform. The Medal of Honor rested in its place of honor, no longer just a symbol of past heroism, but a promise of continued commitment to the principles that made freedom possible. Some wounds could be healed, some debts could be paid, some honors could be restored, and some bonds, between father and son, between brothers in arms, between those who served and those they protected, proved stronger than any force that evil could marshal against them. The road stretched ahead, illuminated by streetlights that stood as sentries against the darkness, and Michael McKenzie rode toward a future where honor still meant something, where service still mattered, and where good men still stood ready to pay whatever price justice demanded. Behind him, Murphy's Corner Market stood as a beacon in the night, its windows glowing with the warm light of a business that had become something more, a symbol of resilience, a testament to the power of community, and a reminder that heroes never truly stand alone. The Brotherhood had ridden, hell had come with them, and from the ashes of violence, something pure and enduring had emerged. If this 5-minute story of honor, brotherhood, and justice moved you as much as it moved me, please take just 2 seconds to hit that like button, share this with a veteran you know, and subscribe for more stories that prove heroes walk among us every day. Honor restored, justice served, and the eternal truth confirmed once again that some things are worth fighting for, some principles are worth dying for, and some men will always stand ready to pay that price for those who cannot protect themselves. In the quiet streets of a California neighborhood, peace reigned because warriors had chosen to make it so. And in the morning, they would wake ready to make that choice again, for as long as breath remained in their bodies and honor lived in their hearts. The morning sun painted the McKenzie Veterans Memorial Garden in shades of gold and amber, its rays filtering through the carefully planted oak trees that had grown from saplings into sturdy guardians of memory. Frank McKenzie, now 81, but still carrying himself with the bearing of a man who'd never learned to surrender, walked the garden's winding paths with the measured pace of someone conducting a sacred ritual. Each memorial stone bore a name, a rank, a date of service, and a brief inscription that captured something essential about the person it honored. Staff Sergeant Williams, not the Marine from Vietnam, but a young soldier from Iraq who'd lost his fight with invisible wounds 2 years after coming home. Corporal Martinez, killed by an IED outside Kandahar. Lieutenant Thompson, who'd survived 3 tours only to die in a motorcycle accident 6 months after returning to civilian life. The garden held 37 stones now, each one representing a member of the local veteran community who'd earned their final rest. Frank paused at the newest addition,
a black granite marker that seemed to absorb the morning light rather than reflect it. Sergeant Major Marcus Antonelli, United States Navy, Afghanistan, Iraq. Brother, protector, friend. The inscription was simple, but beneath it was etched the image of motorcycle wings wrapped around a trident, a symbol that told the story of a man who'd found brotherhood in unlikely places and had served that brotherhood until his final breath. Marcus had died 3 months ago, not from enemy action or criminal violence, but from the cancer that had been growing silently in his chest while he'd been busy protecting others. He'd hidden the diagnosis for over a year, continuing to lead veteran protection operations even as chemotherapy ravaged his body, refusing to show weakness until the very end. His funeral had drawn over 300 bikers from across the country, men and women who'd ridden thousands of miles to honor a brother who'd proven that redemption was possible, that men could change their fundamental nature when they found causes worth serving. "Morning, Marcus," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the easy familiarity of someone continuing a conversation that had been interrupted rather than ended. The sound of approaching footsteps made Frank turn, and he smiled as he saw his son walking up the garden path with the confident stride of someone who'd found his place in the world. Michael looked older, the gray at his temples had spread, and the lines around his eyes spoke of responsibilities willingly shouldered. But there was a contentment in his bearing that had been absent during his military years. McKenzie Security Consulting had grown from a one-man operation into a 30-employee firm that specialized in protecting high-risk individuals and securing sensitive facilities. But their real specialty was veteran services, providing security for veteran events, conducting threat assessments for veteran-owned businesses, and offering personal protection services for former military personnel who'd made enemies during their service years. The business had thrived not because of aggressive marketing or competitive pricing, but because word had spread through the veteran community that Michael McKenzie was someone who could be trusted absolutely.
"Dad," Michael said, his greeting carrying the warmth of someone who'd learned not to take family for granted. "How are you feeling this morning?" "Strong as an ox, stubborn as a mule, and too mean to die," Frank replied with the wry humor that had become his trademark response to health inquiries. The doctors had declared him in remarkable condition for a man his age, attributing his vitality to good genes, regular exercise, and the particular brand of purposefulness that came from having meaningful work to do. They walked together toward the garden's central feature, a reflection pool surrounded by benches that had been donated by various veteran organizations. The pool's still surface mirrored the sky above, creating an effect that seemed to connect earth and heaven in a single peaceful image. It had become a popular spot for meditation and quiet conversation, a place where veterans could process the invisible wounds that didn't show on medical examinations. "The VA called yesterday," Michael said, settling onto one of the benches with the careful movements of someone whose body carried the accumulated damage of a lifetime spent in dangerous professions. "The McKenzie Foundation grant came through, full funding for the next 5 years. Frank's smile carried the satisfaction of someone who'd seen a long-term project reach fruition. The foundation had grown beyond their wildest expectations, evolving from Tommy Castellano's desperate attempt at restitution into a major force in veteran advocacy. The initial $100,000 donation had been leveraged into an endowment worth over $2 million, funding everything from emergency financial assistance to specialized counseling programs to job training initiatives. But perhaps more importantly, the foundation had become a model for community-based veteran support, inspiring similar programs in cities across the country. The McKenzie model, as it had come to be known in policy circles, emphasized local ownership, veteran leadership, and community integration rather than bureaucratic administration. Veterans helping veterans, neighbors supporting neighbors, communities taking responsibility for the men and women who'd served in their name. "There's more," Michael continued, and something in his tone made Frank focus his complete attention. "The Pentagon wants to meet with us next month. They're interested in implementing the McKenzie model at military bases nationwide, creating transition programs that connect retiring service members with local veteran communities before they separate from active duty." Frank felt a profound sense of satisfaction settle in his chest.
the particular contentment that came from seeing seeds planted in darkness finally bloom in sunlight. What had begun as personal tragedy had evolved into systemic change, transforming not just individual lives, but the broader relationship between military and civilian communities. "Your mother would be proud," Frank said quietly, his voice carrying the bittersweet affection of someone who carried love for the departed like a compass pointing toward true north. Margaret McKenzie had believed in the power of communities to heal themselves, in the ability of ordinary people to create extraordinary change when they found common cause. She would have loved seeing the garden, the foundation, the network of support that had grown from the ashes of violence. The morning brought its usual stream of visitors, veterans stopping by for coffee and conversation, family members seeking advice about navigating bureaucratic systems, volunteers coordinating various support programs. Frank and Michael had developed an easy rhythm of collaboration, with Frank handling the interpersonal aspects of foundation work while Michael managed the security and operational challenges. Among the morning's visitors was a young woman in Army fatigues, her bearing suggesting someone fresh from basic training, but carrying herself with the particular confidence that came from having already faced significant challenges. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Walsh had returned from her third deployment to Afghanistan 6 months ago, and she'd been working with the Foundation to establish a support group for female veterans dealing with transition issues. "Mr. McKenzie," she said, approaching Frank with the respectful attention that military personnel showed to decorated veterans. "The women's group has its first official meeting tonight, 12 participants so far, with more expressing interest." Frank's smile carried genuine pride in what she'd accomplished. The challenges faced by female veterans were often different from those encountered by their male counterparts, involving issues of military sexual trauma, societal expectations, and the particular difficulties of transitioning from combat roles to civilian motherhood. Jennifer had recognized those unique needs and had worked tirelessly to create safe spaces for discussion and mutual support. "Outstanding work, Sergeant Walsh. Your leadership skills are going to make a real difference in a lot of lives." Frank's praise was heartfelt and specific, the kind of recognition that meant something coming from someone who'd earned the right to judge leadership under pressure. As the day progressed, Frank found himself reflecting on the changes that 5 years had brought to his corner of the world. Murphy's Corner Market still operated as a neighborhood grocery, but it had become something more. A community center where veterans gathered, a resource center where information was shared, a symbol of resilience that inspired other small businesses to become more involved in supporting local veterans. The neighborhood itself had transformed as well. Property values had increased as word spread about the community's commitment to veteran support, attracting families who wanted to live at a place where service was honored and sacrifice was remembered. New businesses had opened, many of them veteran-owned, creating an ecosystem of mutual support that strengthened both the local economy and the social fabric. But perhaps the most significant change was less visible. The shift in how civilians related to veterans, the growing understanding that supporting the troops meant more than displaying bumper stickers or standing for the national anthem. It meant creating communities where veterans could thrive, where their skills were valued, where their sacrifices were honored through action rather than rhetoric. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Detective Sarah Chen, now Captain Chen after a series of promotions that had recognized her exceptional work in community policing. She'd become a regular presence at the store, not in her official capacity, but as someone who understood the value of the network that had grown around Frank's story. "Frank, Michael," she said, her greeting carrying the easy familiarity of someone who'd become part of the extended family. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something. We arrested 3 suspects this morning in connection with the armed robbery of that Korean War veteran in Oakland last week." Frank's expression hardened slightly, the transformation subtle but unmistakable. The attack on 83-year-old Harold Kim had sent shockwaves through the veteran community, not because such crimes were uncommon, but because this particular assault had been marked by deliberate cruelty, including the destruction of Mr. Kim's Bronze Star and Purple Heart medals. "Local criminals or organized?" Michael asked, his tone shifting into the analytical mode that had made him successful in both military operations and civilian security work.
Local, but with connections to some bigger players. The interesting thing is that they were specifically warned not to target veterans. Apparently, word has spread pretty thoroughly through criminal networks that attacking military personnel brings unwanted attention. Sarah's smile carried grim satisfaction. The problem is that these three are newcomers from out of state, and they didn't get the message. Frank and Michael exchanged glances, the kind of wordless communication that had developed between them over years of working together on veteran advocacy issues. The network that had protected veterans in their immediate area had grown organically, spreading through criminal communities like a virus of common sense, but it couldn't reach everywhere at once. "What do you need from us?" Frank asked, his tone suggesting someone prepared to provide whatever assistance might be required. "Nothing official," Sarah replied carefully. "But it occurred to me that Mr. Kim might benefit from knowing that he's not alone, that there are people who understand what his service meant and who are prepared to ensure that justice is served appropriately." The conversation that followed was conducted in the careful language of people who understood that some forms of justice existed outside official channels, but who also recognized the importance of maintaining plausible deniability. No explicit promises were made, no specific actions were discussed, but understanding was reached about the nature of community responsibility and the obligations that came with allowing evil to flourish unchallenged. The afternoon began his closing routine with the same methodical precision that had characterized his approach to important tasks for over 60 decades. But tonight there was an additional element: a phone call to Oakland, a conversation with an elderly veteran who needed to know that his service.
After ending the call, Frank walked once more through the memorial garden, his evening ritual taking on additional significance as he contemplated the continuing struggle between those who served and those who preyed upon service. The garden's paths were illuminated by solar lights that had been donated by a local veteran-owned electrical contractor, creating pools of gentle radiance that made the memorial stones seem to glow from within. At Marcus's grave, Frank paused for a longer conversation, sharing the day's events with his departed friend and seeking the kind of guidance that came from remembering how good men had handled similar challenges. Marcus had understood better than most that protecting veterans required more than good intentions. It demanded organization, resources, and the willingness to act decisively when legal systems proved inadequate. "We've got another one, brother," Frank said quietly. "Korean War veteran in Oakland. 3 suspects in custody, but probably not the whole network. Michael's already making calls, reaching out to contacts in the Bay Area." The wind rustled through the oak trees, and Frank chose to interpret the sound as approval, as encouragement to continue the work that had become his life's mission. The network that had grown from his personal tragedy now extended across most of California and into other states, connecting veteran advocates, law enforcement officials, and concerned citizens who understood that protecting those who'd served was a community responsibility. Michael's approach interrupted his meditation, the younger man's footsteps careful and deliberate on the garden's gravel paths. "I talked to Rodriguez in San Francisco. He's got connections with some people who might be able to provide additional context about the Oakland situation." Rodriguez was a former Marine colonel who transitioned into civilian law enforcement, eventually becoming a deputy chief in the San Francisco Police Department. More importantly, he was a member of the informal network that had grown around veteran protection efforts, a group of men and women who shared information and coordinated responses to threats against the military community. "And," Frank prompted, recognizing the tone that indicated more complex information was forthcoming, "it's not random. The 3 suspects were specifically recruited for this job by someone who knew Kim's routine, his living situation, his financial circumstances. Someone did advanced work, surveillance, planning." Michael's voice carried the flat precision of someone delivering tactical intelligence. This wasn't opportunistic street crime. It was a targeted operation. Frank felt something cold settle in his stomach,
the recognition that they were dealing with a more sophisticated threat than simple criminal opportunism. Organized targeting of veterans suggested either a criminal enterprise that specialized in such victims, or, worse, some kind of systematic campaign designed to terrorize the military community. "Same pattern as what happened to you 5 years ago," Michael continued. "Someone with access to personal information, someone who understood the victim's vulnerabilities, someone who could recruit local muscle for the actual assault." The implications were troubling on multiple levels. If there was indeed an organized effort to target veterans, it represented a threat that went beyond individual crimes to constitute an attack on the broader military community. Such operations required coordination, resources, and the intelligence gathering that suggested professional criminal organization rather than street-level predation. "What's our next move?" Frank asked, though he already suspected the answer. "Road trip to Oakland. Time to have some conversations with people who might have information about who's behind this pattern." Michael's tone carried the matter-of-fact acceptance of someone who'd spent his adult life confronting complex threats with appropriate responses. The drive to Oakland took place in the pre-dawn darkness, with Frank riding as passenger in Michael's armored SUV, while maintaining radio contact with other vehicles that carried additional security personnel. The McKenzie security team had grown to include several former special operations personnel who understood the delicate balance between legal investigation and practical action. The Oakland veteran community had rallied around Harold Kim with impressive speed and efficiency, providing both emotional support and practical security while the investigation continued. But the network there was newer, less established than the system that had developed around Frank's situation, and it lacked the connections necessary to address sophisticated criminal operations. Kim's small apartment in a converted warehouse district showed signs of the struggle that had taken place: overturned furniture, broken glass that spoke of violence deliberately inflicted to maximize trauma rather than simply overcome resistance. The old veteran himself bore the physical marks of the assault, but his eyes held the particular steel that came from having survived worse things in foreign wars. "Mr. McKenzie," he said, his voice carrying the formal courtesy of someone raised in an era in which respect was demonstrated through precise language and careful attention to protocol. "I appreciate you coming. The local police have been helpful, but I get the sense they're treating this as an isolated incident rather than part of something larger." Frank studied the man before him, recognizing a kindred spirit in someone who'd learned to carry invisible burdens with dignity and grace. Kim had the bearing of someone who'd faced death in service to his country and had come home to build a quiet life marked by service to his community. The attack on him hadn't just been criminal assault, it had been a violation of the social contract that promised veterans they could age in peace. "Tell me about the days leading up to the attack," Frank said, settling into a chair that allowed him to maintain visual contact with both Kim and the apartment's entrances. "Did you notice anyone taking unusual interest in your routine? Any strangers asking questions about you in the neighborhood?"
Kim's recollection was precise and methodical, the account of someone trained to observe and remember details that might prove tactically significant. He'd noticed the same van parked on his street for 3 consecutive days, had observed someone photographing the building's entrances, had fielded phone calls from people claiming to represent various veteran organizations, but asking questions that seemed more focused on his personal circumstances than legitimate program eligibility. "They knew things," Kim said, his voice carrying the troubled tone of someone who'd realized the extent of his vulnerability. "About my service record, about my financial situation, about the fact that I lived alone. Information that wasn't public, that would have required access to military records or VA databases." Frank felt pieces of a larger puzzle beginning to fall into place, connections forming between apparently isolated incidents that suggested systematic exploitation of veteran vulnerability.
Someone with access to official records was identifying targets, conducting surveillance, and coordinating attacks designed to terrorize the military community while generating profit for criminal enterprises. The investigation that followed consumed 3 days and involved coordination with law enforcement agencies, veteran advocacy organizations, and members of the informal security network that had grown around veteran protection efforts. The picture that emerged was troubling in its implications. A sophisticated operation that combined identity theft, database infiltration, and organized criminal recruitment to systematically target elderly veterans who lived alone and maintained significant cash assets. The mastermind behind the operation turned out to be someone with intimate knowledge of both military culture and criminal networks, a former Army sergeant who'd been dishonorably discharged for financial crimes and had spent the subsequent decade developing expertise in exploiting the very community he'd once served. Leonard Weasel Carmichael had used his military connections to gain access to personnel databases while employing his criminal contacts to recruit local muscle for actual assaults. The confrontation with Carmichael took place in a warehouse that had been converted into an illegal gambling operation, a venue that provided both cover for criminal activity and multiple escape routes for someone who understood that his activities had made him numerous enemies. But Carmichael had made the fundamental error of assuming that his former military service would provide some protection against retaliation from the veteran community. "You've got no right to be here," Carmichael said when Frank and Michael entered the main gambling floor, their presence immediately recognized as a threat by someone who'd spent years looking over his shoulder. "This is a private business establishment." Frank studied the man before him, seeing someone who'd taken everything valuable about military service, the brotherhood, the shared sacrifice, the commitment to mutual protection, and had perverted it into a tool for victimizing the very people who'd once been his comrades. "Sergeant Carmichael," Frank said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd earned the right to judge military conduct. Or should I say, former Sergeant Carmichael, dishonorably discharged for embezzling from unit welfare funds, if I remember the court-martial records correctly. The recognition that his background was known seemed to deflate some of Carmichael's bravado, but his response carried the particular arrogance of someone who'd convinced himself that his crimes were justified by circumstances beyond his control. "The Army screwed me over, just like they screw over everyone who doesn't play their political games. I'm just evening the score, taking from people who got benefits I was denied." Carmichael's voice carried the whining resentment of someone who'd never learned to accept responsibility for his own choices. Michael stepped forward, his movement carrying the fluid precision of someone prepared to respond to resistance with overwhelming force. "You're targeting elderly veterans, men and women who served their country with honor, who earned their benefits through blood and sacrifice." "Spare me the patriotic bullshit," Carmichael replied, but his eyes were calculating escape routes and assessing the tactical situation with the instincts of someone who'd learned to survive in hostile environments. "Those old fucks are sitting on piles of cash while younger veterans can't get the help they need. I'm just redistributing the wealth." The conversation that followed was conducted in the careful language of people who understood that violence was always an option, but who preferred to achieve their objectives through more elegant means. Carmichael had information that could lead to the arrest of his criminal collaborators, but he also possessed knowledge of other veteran targeting operations that extended beyond California. The negotiation process was complex, involving federal law enforcement agencies, military criminal investigation units, and the informal network of veteran advocates who'd become stakeholders in ensuring that justice was served appropriately. Carmichael eventually agreed to provide comprehensive cooperation in exchange for protective custody and reduced sentences, understanding that his alternatives were limited and unappealing. But the most satisfying moment came when Harold Kim's Bronze Star and Purple Heart were recovered from Carmichael's personal collection, along with medals stolen from dozens of other veterans across the western United States. The ceremony where those decorations were returned to their rightful owners took place in the McKenzie Veterans Memorial Garden with representatives from veteran organizations throughout California. "These medals don't belong to the men who earned them," Frank said during his remarks at the ceremony, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd with the authority of someone who'd learned to speak truth in all circumstances.
They belong to all of us, to everyone who understands that freedom requires guardians, that civilization needs protectors, that some things are worth sacrificing for even when the cost seems too high to bear. Harold Kim received his decorations with the dignity of someone who'd never doubted their meaning, but whose faith in their security had been shaken by the realization that there were people willing to profit from attacking what others held sacred. The ceremony was simple but profound, a reminder that honor was not just an abstract concept, but a living commitment that required constant defense. As the sun set over the memorial garden, painting the sky in shades of red, white, and blue that seemed almost too perfect to be coincidental, Frank reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 5 years earlier, he'd been a victim, broken and bleeding on the floor of his own store. Today, he was the center of a network that protected veterans across multiple states, a symbol of resilience that inspired others to stand up against those who preyed on the innocent. The work was far from finished. There would always be predators who sought to exploit the vulnerable, criminals who mistook honor for weakness, people who needed to learn that attacking veterans brought consequences that legal systems couldn't mitigate. But the network was strong now, established, growing with each new member who understood that protecting those who'd served was not just a moral obligation, but a practical necessity for maintaining the kind of society worth defending. Michael joined him on the bench beside the reflection pool, both men comfortable with the silence that came from shared understanding of what they'd accomplished and what remained to be done. The garden around them represented more than a memorial to the fallen. It was a promise to the living, a commitment that their service would be honored, their sacrifices remembered, their vulnerabilities protected by people who understood the true cost of freedom. "What's next, Dad?" Michael asked, his tone suggesting someone who'd found peace with whatever challenges lay ahead. Frank smiled, his eyes reflecting the same contentment that came from having found purpose that transcended personal interest. "Same thing as always, son. We keep the faith. We protect our own. We make sure that anyone who thinks honor is weakness learns otherwise before they can hurt someone else's father." The stars were beginning to appear overhead, their light joining with the garden's memorial flames to create an atmosphere of quiet reverence. Somewhere in the distance, the sound of motorcycle engines announced the arrival of the evening security patrol, former Angels and other veteran bikers who'd taken on the responsibility of ensuring that the memorial garden remained a place of peace. Frank McKenzie, Medal of Honor recipient, father, protector, symbol of everything that made military service meaningful, settled back against the bench and prepared to keep watch over his community for as long as strength remained in his body and purpose lived in his heart. The brotherhood was strong, honor was defended, and justice, like the eternal flame that burned in memory of the fallen, would continue to shine as long as good men were willing to tend its fire.